Welcome to The Real Truth About Drugs, the only place anywhere on the internet, anywhere on TV, anywhere in the world where you're going to get the real, absolute, uncensored truth about drugs, science, spirituality, questions of life and death, as well as the afterlife. Um, so let's dive right in. Uh, Today, we're going to be looking at and discussing in depth um, a little known fact. It's been more talked about in the last few decades. However, the government has done and continues to do a really good job of keeping this under wraps. So, what am I talking about? I am talking about Project MK Ultra, the CIA mind control experiment that spanned decades, over 25 years. Um, at which point all the documents were destroyed because this was right after Watergate, and the government did not want another Watergate scandal, so they made sure that they tried to destroy all documentation and any proof that MK Ultra ever existed. Um, this was also known as Project Monarch, Project Artichoke, um, Mockingbird, which is and Blue Jay, among other things. But it spanned over 150 projects and included over 80 institutions, including world-renowned universities and medical hospitals, and really prominent doctors that took part of this horrible. I mean, I have trouble even calling it experimentation because it really wasn't. It was straight up torture. And although the government claims that it ended in 1974, we have a lot of reason to doubt them. And and when I tell you all about it, um, I think you're going to have a lot of reason to doubt ever believing the government again about anything, ever. And I think the reason it's gotten more traction, particularly in recent years, is because of people's interest in the conspiracy theory about Freemasonry, the Illuminati, and their mind control of certain celebrities, particularly celebrities that are extremely popular. And if you look at the evidence that surrounds it, after we talk about this, if you guys want me to do a video about that, then I will. Honestly, there's a particular reason that I chose MK Ultra as a topic, as my first topic. I could go down the rabbit hole because I have personally, um, with these topics, known as conspiracies. I don't like to call this a conspiracy theory because it is not a theory, it is a proven fact. There are over 20,000 declassified documents, which, is partly what I used in terms of my research, as well as, eyewitness accounts and, eh, doctors and scientists who actually participated among, uh, unwilling participants that were tormented in this project. Um, but again, the reason that I chose this is because as we get into further down the line, delving really deep into psychedelics and their medicinal uses, um, the way that they are able to unlock parts of our brain, and sort of open our mind, open our consciousness, the consciousness of humanity, towards a greater understanding and connectedness towards really ourselves. And the understanding of our consciousness, because Western medicine leaves a lot to be desired as far as that. We don't ever examine the only advances that we've ever done in terms of scientific biology has to do with examining the bodies once they are dead. So we leave a very critical factor out of medicine, which is the connectedness of consciousness and our body, which is, I can't stress how important that is, which is why Western medicine, versus Eastern medicine, leaves a lot to be desired. And that's why other nations, including, you know Southeast Asian medicine, which is a holistic approach, meaning whole approach, not has nothing to do with new age. It just means examining the body as a whole as opposed to just symptomatic, like we do here. I thought that in watching The Fifth Estate, which was a documentary that was released in 1985, um, I think it was a Canadian documentary that talked about the illicit drugging of a number of Canadian citizens. And, they were pushing the Canadian government to sue the United States for its unwitting part, participation and drugging of its citizens without their permission. Because if the CIA is doing an experiment and they are tormenting their own citizens, then I guess they're like, well, that's kind of your problem, but why are you tormenting our citizens without, our permission? But the thing is that it spans so, like, across so much more than that. They actually went so much farther internationally than anyone has any idea. So this spans across to France, the Philippines, Germany, Canada, um, and it wasn't just an unwitting um, citizens and civilians, because there was a few of the people who were tormented in these experiments who actually asked for help. Not that that makes them, you know, uh, witting participants, because if you're going in because you have a headache or migraines or insomnia or depression or anxiety, it doesn't mean that you have asked to be tormented repeatedly to the point of pushing you to suicide, or psychosis, or erasing your entire identity. Like, obviously that's not what you signed up for, but at least they I mean, I don't want to say at least anything, it doesn't make sense, but what I'm saying is that these people signed up for something. So they at least knew that they were going to a laboratory for something, and that they may be participating in something that they thought was going to help, whatever small problem they had, which, as I said, um, ranged from, you know, migraines or headaches to anxiety to depression, insomnia, small issues like that, to a number of I couldn't believe this when I read this. I believe he tormented between, I don't know if it was like 600 or 6 to 1200 um, young boys, ranging, in ages between, like, 6 and 12. And he tormented them um, because with these horrible experiments, which we'll get into what they were specifically, um, for being effeminate. So these were kids that their parents thought that they might be gay. Um, maybe they weren't gay at all. Maybe they just had mannerisms that, according to these horrible, just disgusting parents, and they sent them to these crazy, psychotic doctors who have gotten, this pass by the government to do whatever they want to whomever they want, um, and subjected these kids to months and months of torture. So the torture that they subjected to them to ranged from um, illicit doses of LSD, which were far beyond the normal range of, what would be a normal acid trip. It was normally between 3 and 6 times the normal dose that someone would need to have a very, very strong trip. And because, these drugs were all relatively new, they didn't even know what a normal dose was. So they were just playing with people's minds, particularly because some of the objectives of these experiments were psychosis. So they were trying to make people go completely crazy. So some of them, the motive was psychosis. In some other experiments, the purpose was to erase the participant's identity, uh, and then to instill a new identity. And that's going to be important later on. I don't know if I'm going to make a second video or if I'm just going to make it in one. Whatever I choose, if you guys want to tell me in the comments below what you prefer, what's easier for you, if you prefer it to be in 2 parts or if it's just better to be in one, just let me know. And again, like I said, if you guys really, really want me to do a celebrity ties, as well as Disney ties to the MK Ultra project, then I can do that as well. Um, but we'll see. So erasing the identity, putting in a new one, psychosis. These were all the purposes of the experiment. Ultimately, it was just mind control. They were trying to make sleeper agents, so people that they could put in a code word, that they could have handlers, that they either through hypnosis or through hypnosis induced. Uh, Through this LSD, their hope, although that didn't work because LSD works to open up your mind, not to close it up. However, for those of you who have ever tripped, you know how sensitive um, you are to really anything, to any stimulation whatsoever, or coercion. Um, you know, I remember once my friend showed me this weird YouTube video, and I was like kind of seeing weird intentions, and I saw his aura change, and it kind of freaked me out. It had some weird cartoons about Hitler, and I was like, what are you trying to do? And this was me being, very consciously aware. These people were, while under the influence of, like, 3, 6, 10 times the dose, maybe higher, of what you're supposed to take for a very, very, you know, um, hallucinatory trip where you're going to see a really wide array of visuals. It was far, far worse than that. And then they sleep deprived them, so they would not let them sleep for days on end, and while chained to a bed. Imagine how horrible that trip must be to begin with. They put on these headphones forcibly and made them listen to affirmations repeated over and over again. That I listened to these affirmations, and without being on anything, it freaked me the hell out. I was having nightmares just from listening to what they made these people listen to. It was like, you have no identity, you will obey, you will follow commands, like it was basically trying to erase their prior identity. And in the Fifth Estate, which you guys should watch, there was one particular victim of MK Ultra who they managed to erase, I believe, the previous 20 years of her life, and she never remembered who she was prior to having been in there. Luckily, she was able to survive, or unluckily, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, because most of the survivors of this went on to commit suicide. And actually, one of the poor victims of it was able to escape where he was being held and went up to the roof and threw himself off. That's how horrible this torture was.
Tell me about the acid. I'd rather not. It's a bad trip. It's a bad trip. That was a bad trip. The pain was so excruciating. Felt like somebody was sticking me with a million pins. Just everywhere. Oh, it just... You want to stop for me? I walked around. You want to stop? Oh, I can talk. I lived through it. I lived through it.
No charges were ever brought by the Army against Thornwell. He was discharged for psychological disorders. It houses the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry of Mengele University. It was here that the CIA funded a series of experiments, severe experiments. The work was done by the Institute's then director, Dr. Ewan Cameron. It is the closest experimentation to brainwashing yet disclosed. His work, unprecedented in psychiatry, consisted of 3 areas which he called sleep therapy, psychic driving, and the ultimate depatterning. Dr. Maurice Dongier, current head of the Allen Memorial Institute.
In his psychic driving, so-called type of therapy, he would give the patient intensive electric treatment in order to make the patient regress deeply, become forgetful, and then he would attempt to implant new ideas in the mind of the patient.
Now, to a layman, it would appear that Dr. Cameron was trying to take the slate and wipe it clean, the slate being the mind. In other words, brainwashing.
Exactly, that's a very good comparison.
Brainwashing.
Yes. to life.
Val Orlico of Winnipeg, Canada, the wife of a member of the Canadian Parliament, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. She entered the Allen Memorial Institute because of severe depression. She describes for the first time publicly the LSD therapy and psychic driving treatment that she was given by Dr. Cameron.
And then the drug began to take hold very rapidly because it was an IV injection. And things became very furry and very frightening, and had a lot of sensations that it's very difficult to recall. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything.
He had this feeling that he would be able to get through the resistance of illness and to reach deep changes very quickly.
Did he?
I don't think that when you look at that in retrospect, the hopes that he had have been in any way fulfilled.
But Cameron would plunge on. The next step was what he called psychic driving. This involved almost endless tape-recorded messages and more drugs for the patient. Cameron wrote that this was the way to make direct controlled changes in personality.
I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world. And I became more and more despondent and more angry. I just became so despondent that I thought I can't live like this any longer. And I thought I would just go out and throw myself underneath the cars on McGregor. I stood on the curb of that street and I stood there and I thought, okay, go. And then I thought, what if you're not killed? What if you're just maimed? What if you don't die and you live and you can't even talk anymore? And I couldn't do it.
The most severe technique Cameron used was depatterning. He described it as breaking up the existing patterns of behavior by means of intensive electroshock therapy with prolonged periods of sleep. He carried out these experiments in something he called the sleep rooms.
Most people tried to. There was a lot of also victims, patients, whatever you want to call them, that escaped and ran right. One of them ran right, and I believe it's someone who was in the Fifth Estate interview, ran right in front of a truck and tried to kill herself. Unsuccessfully. They chased her down, the orderlies, attacked her in the street, and dragged her right back into forced psychosis treatment. She was one of the people that was being, I believe, induced with LSD and then, sleep deprived and forcibly made to listen to this horrible brainwashing audio tapes. So just so you get an idea of how just horrible this torture was. Among other tortures was electroshock therapy in conjunction. So sometimes it was just some of these things, sometimes it was all of them together. Electric shock therapy, temperature variations from freezing to hot, freezing cold to super hot, and then in between. It was so horrible. I mean, just doing this research, I don't know how these people survived. I mean, honestly, if I was there, a lot of them, talk about how they tried to kill themselves and they just didn't have, because they were chained to a bed or whatever. I don't know what I would have done in being in a situation like that. I might have, if I had been chained, maybe use the handcuffs to slit my wrist or something, because I honestly don't know how these poor people were able to survive this. And to hear about the range of how far this went. So it wasn't just unwitting victims, participants in the United States. It was also used on prisoners, so different prison populations throughout the United States, and then internationally. As I said, on poor children as well, who were, thought to be effeminate or maybe potentially homosexual, were tortured. I can't imagine how many of those poor kids, went on to commit suicide. And then overseas, the situation was even worse. So apparently this was used on prisoners of war, political refugees who had no other family. So if you were a political refugee at that time, and just for you to get a time frame of when this started in 1950. They said it started in 1953, but really the first incident goes as far back as 1950. Stemming to 1974, which was when they were basically caught and had to appear before the Senate committee, which was later known as the Church Committee, and then two other committees that were formulated just to supposedly review the humanity or inhumanity of these experiments, as well as to supposedly hold people legally accountable, which never happened. But we'll circle back around to the end. But just to give you an idea of how long this went on, and that's supposedly when it ended. But who's to say? Because it doesn't sound like if these things ended. It sounds like if they did, decades and decades of research, and then they tried to make it sound like if the whole thing was a flop. I mean, if it was so unsuccessful, then why did you go on for 25 years? I mean, during this period and during Project MK Ultra was when they they actually found the beginning of astral projection, or OBEs, out of body experiments or experiences, that was able to and remote viewing, and the CIA started this. What people don't understand is that in 1974, when this project ended, it was actually the beginning of the NSA, which is the National Security Agency, which at which point, now they have a number of different agencies that we don't even know what they're called, because that leaves us totally out of the loop. What they were able to figure out at that point is that by creating the NSA, and you guys saw this with Snowden, they are able to say that anything that we ask about is a matter of national security. So they have no legal reason and no expectation of having to give us any explanation. So all this served to do at the end of 1974 is to move this underground, and this is literally underground because there have been known to be a number of underground facilities that the NSA uses, as well as international bases also underground, so that the laws either of nations or of man in general don't apply to them. And very recently, having created a pig man, so a man who genetically is half human and half pig. And again, I'm going to link these articles below, because as fictitious and crazy as these claims sound, these are not claims being made by the National Enquirer. These are claims that there were articles written. This is proven. I believe it was in the New York Times, or the Washington Post, maybe all of them. A small little snippet, because nobody wants to talk about this. Probably, I think this was amidst all the stuff going on with Trump. So while everyone's focusing on him, whatever he said on Twitter, human beings are being hybrid cloned with pigs. And supposedly their whole idea of that was, that they were using it to transplant organs or whatever, which I think yesterday or the day before, or recently, they did the first pig human transplant, and they're seeing if it takes. But that's impossible unless that pig has human DNA in it, which it does, because we've known this. But I'll do a separate video on that if you guys want. My whole point is that for people who say that these are just conspiracy theories, or that this kind of things have stopped, it's ridiculous to think that it has. It's just that now we're not being told, because when when these things did get exposed, like it happened with this, they just made sure that no memos ever reached any outside ears. That's all that happened. So as I was saying, in these international bases, or facilities that they had set up for the purposes of MK Ultra, they used prisoners of war, they used political refugees, and just random citizens so if the refugees had no family or friends that knew about them, then they were the perfect candidate to torture. And there was one facility, I believe it was in Germany. I want to say Frankfurt, but I will make sure because I don't want to, give wrong information, but I know that the neighboring towns said that they, would hear the screams of the people in this facility, and that when they were done torturing and killing them, that they would use the bodies, they would dispose of the bodies in the woods, in the surrounding area, which have now been covered with, um, they've built up um, condos and townhouses and shopping centers. So, there's no way to ever find the bodies because they're really buried underneath. Um, but we'll get back to that. I may have to make a second video where I really get into Gottlieb, who was the person who ran Project MKUltra for all 24 years. And he was known as the poisoner in chief. So just so you know how evil, truly evil, this man was, his inspiration, the guy that he wanted to emulate and model, was Mengele, who, for those of you who don't know, is also known as the Angel of Death, who was the doctor scientist who performed these horrible, horrible, if you can call them experiments, torture on poor Jewish Holocaust victims. I think it was mostly in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. Now, this man, Gottlieb, would have been a victim of the Holocaust had he not escaped with his parents beforehand. So to think that this man, who so narrowly escaped being a victim of concentration camps himself, which I'm sorry to say, I mean, I guess I can't say that because my video might take it down, but you guys know what I was going to say. It might have been better, because clearly he had no compassion for these poor victims of this man, because he got most of his ideas. So all of the ideas for the poisons that he chose and the way that he conducted his torture came from this man, Mengele. So he wanted to emulate him. He emulated his forms of torture. He emulated the poisons that he used. And he went so far as his admiration for Nazi officers that actually, when he put together his group of scientists, he chose Nazi officers who worked with Mengele and participated in the torture of thousands and thousands of millions of Jews and their murder and poison. And he used a lot of the same poisons, which I imagine he must have used fluoride and a number of other things, poison gas and all of that. But his definite drug of choice was LSD, which he actually liked to take himself, along with another colleague of his named Louis Jolly West, fitting name for such psychos, who I will go into a whole thing about him later on, because there's so much to say and uncover about him. So I might have to just make a separate video of that. But going back to the beginning of Project MKUltra. So before the CIA was even the CIA, they were called the Office of Strategic Services. And way back when, in 1943, the OSS, which was then the CIA, released a memo known as the motion, or a memo on the motion pictures as weapons. That was the title of the memo. And in this memo, it outlines the psychological power that films have on the psyche of the viewer. And so it focused on how films can be used in order to alter the perception of individuals. And it also covered how motion pictures, movies, films can be used as a militarized psychological warfare operation. And it explains how intelligence agencies of that era, which was in the early 1940s, used motion pictures as powerful propaganda weapons in order to guide and manipulate the collective hive mind in order to get desired behavioral results from the public in the nation as well as internationally. And probably what they were talking about was Hitler's infamous use of propaganda in order to affect the hive mind of the German population in order to basically get everyone on his side in terms of blaming the Jews for all their problems, as well as painting them as, the propaganda that he used in order to begin the Holocaust, but as how he used and weaponized basically these films and the propaganda that he used at that time in order to get everyone hating the Jewish population for no reason. So this is a paraphrase from the memo. The motion picture is one of the most powerful propaganda weapons at the disposal of the United States. It can serve many diversified functions, and I'm going to go through all the functions that they name. But before I get into that, just to use as an example, the CIA was well aware of very, very well aware of the use of movies as propaganda, not just by Hitler's example of the way that he was able to weaponize movies in order to get an entire nation to join in his targeting of uh, nations of certain nationalities during the Holocaust, but they knew far before then because the first Hollywood movie ever made was actually in 1910, and the first propaganda movie that they made, I mean, they might have made them before, but the really, really big one that everyone remembers, it was in 1915, and it was called The Birth of a Nation, and it was a movie that celebrated slavery and racism, and basically was propaganda for the KKK. And it talked about how wonderful the KKK was, and they ended up being the hero against, the horrible North that was trying to, stop them and end slavery. And so that's the first real use of movies as a weapon, as propaganda, as a militarized weapon, to create a hive mentality that racism is wonderful and great, and that slavery is great, and that, you could be the racist hero at the end of the day. So going into how these can be used as powerful propaganda, uh, it can serve many diversified functions. So, motion pictures are an unparalleled instructional medium. They can present new facts concerning important problems on which people are ignorant and on which they ought to be informed. And they can clarify complicated problems on which people are confused. That'd be a nice thing, right? If it were actually clarifying complicated problems and, giving people a medium to give people important facts on which they're ignorant. It would be wonderful if it wasn't used as propaganda in order to give ignorant minds the wrong ideas about what they should think. B, motion pictures are a potent force in attitude formation, and attitudes are the basis of action and morale. So clearly they were aware of this way back in 1915 when they formulated and brought out the propaganda Birth of a Nation. C, motion pictures can stimulate or inhibit action. So they're clearly aware of the use, and this continues on until this day. They're clearly aware about how motion pictures can help people formulate ideas as well as, bring people out for or against a cause. D, motion pictures can orient the individual to affairs beyond his personal experience by providing opportunities for vicarious participation. Newsreels, for example, are the best medium for giving the remote citizen the feel of frontline combat. E, motion pictures can be employed on most of the major psychological warfare fronts. F, they can be aimed at civilians and armed forces of the United States in order to inform and instruct, to create attitudes, to stimulate or exhibit action, or to build morale. So here I think I'm seeing more of an aim to get people probably to meaning morale or action. It's a call to get people to sign up for the armed forces. Way back when they had a lot of propaganda. I don't remember what it was like he wants you or something like that, and it was I don't remember what president. Or G, they can be aimed at the people of countries allied to the United States, of countries occupied by the United States, or her allies of countries neutral to the United States, in order to inform and to create attitudes favorable to the U.S. and unfavorable to the enemy. So I guess if you're an enemy of the U.S., then you have problems. They can be aimed at internees, prisoners of war, antagonistic groups in occupied or neutral countries to inform and to convert to attitudes which favor the United States. So they were very well aware of this, and this was pretty clear in regards to anybody that the United States was at war with. It's a pretty beehive mentality that was you are pro-America and against whatever country America's at war with. And finally, agencies functions directed towards the civilians of the U.S. for the production, distribution, exhibition of domestic motion pictures, Hollywood companies, and others. So the memo mentions the use of domestic agencies such as Hollywood in order to use motion pictures as weapons, and this gave birth to something called Operation Mockingbird, which began all the way back in 1940, and this was used as the use of Operation Mockingbird was as propaganda and as a psychological weapon that's been used against us since the 1940s. Operation Mockingbird was a fully implemented CIA program whose purpose was to spread disinformation throughout American media. CIA Director William Colby testified to the Church Committee that over 400 CIA agents were active in the U.S. media in order to control what was reported through American mainstream television, newspaper, and magazines. So this shows how far back the use of the CIA goes in terms of controlling all the media. So this is mainstream television, newspapers, as well as magazines. So from the 1940s, this propaganda has been being used in order for the government, for the CIA, to control the narrative. So there's no such thing as free speech and free thought. The idea that, journalists are independent and that they are formulating their own opinions and that they are free to report on what they want, that is a completely naive view of the truth of what's going on. So part of the reason that I chose this CIA mind control as the topic for, my first ever video was to inform all of you that we are not free. Our thoughts are not free. And, the media as you see it, you might want to think that the news is independent, that there's, right and left, and, maybe Fox is a little bit weird, but all the rest are pretty reliable. And it's just not true. The disinformation that we are being fed is blatant. And as you fall deeper and deeper down into the rabbit hole with me, if you choose to do that, some people might get scared. And that's okay. If your mind is not ready to take, the red pill and you want to fall back asleep into the matrix because, it's way too much outside of your comfort zone to understand that the people that are supposed to be looking out for you might have nefarious intentions at heart, then that's fine. But if you are prepared to see the truth, then this is just the beginning.